Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to remind you that your video and audio are shut off for this webinar. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box in the menu probably at the bottom of your screen. I would like to introduce our other panelists, Norm Scheer, who's the president of the Michigan Master Gardener Association, Vicki Lauren, who's the secretary. I'm Sue Augard. I'm vice president and co-treasurer with Ruth Steele Walker. And Ruth is going to be introducing our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Sue. It's my pleasure to introduce Dan O'Keefe, who's an MSU educator serving 7 counties along Lake Michigan. He's part of the Michigan Sea Grant program. In his talk tonight on Great Lakes Invaders and Ecology, he will share insights about current invasive species invading the Great Lakes and what is being done to both identify and control these species. Dan earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in Fisheries and Wildlife from MSU, a Master's in Biology from CMU, and a Doctorate in Wildlife and Fisheries from Mississippi State University. He's been involved with the DNR regarding fishery issues, on a government council on offshore wind energy legislation, and a Michigan House committee regarding Asian carp and other invasive species. So I think you'll agree with me that we're very fortunate to have him here to share his expertise with us tonight. Dan?
Thanks. See if I can get my screen shared here. So today I'll be talking a bit about aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes, and it kind of gives you a case study of just how dramatically even just a few aquatic invasive species can really restructure an entire ecosystem. And now we have at least 188 aquatic invasive species that have become established in the Great Lakes, and many more that have been introduced and have not become established. So we really have invasive species at all levels of the food web in the Great Lakes. And as you'll see, even a couple of them have really restructured things pretty dramatically. So some of the information I'll share today, I'll just give a little plug. We have a new, oh, you probably can't see it now, it's phasing out, but The Life of the Lakes is a book that Sea Grant produces, and every few years we revise it. So we have a new 2019 edition out that is the 4th edition. It contains a lot of the figures and graphics that I'll share today related to the Great Lakes fisheries and invasive species. So of course, the Great Lakes have changed a lot over the years, and fisheries have changed from subsistence fishing that was done by Native American peoples who inhabited the region. At that time, we classify the different eras of history, and we classify that era as the era of abundance, when fishing was sustainable and it was carried out in a way that didn't damage populations long term. And after that, we went into an era of exploitation and degradation when European settlers arrived and began clear cutting all of the timber. That had a large effect on the fish. The timber actually came down the rivers and destroyed a lot of spawning habitat. It littered the bottoms of the rivers with a lot of sand and silt that smothered spawning beds. And the building of dams restricted other fish from getting up from the Great Lakes into tributaries to spawn. Fish like sturgeon are very long-lived fish, but they couldn't really sustain themselves without access to their spawning grounds. And then on top of that, we had overexploitation. And it's important to note, being a fisheries biologist, we're always studying exploited populations. So there's a difference between fishing at a level that's sustainable and then the overfishing that we got in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You see the photo of the Earl Bess there and a huge haul of fish from Lake Erie. And for many decades, fishing was essentially unregulated. So people caught more and more fish, as many as they could. They started using smaller nets to try to catch smaller fish once the big fish were gone. And eventually, we started implementing some fisheries management, some control on harvest, and began trying to restore the fisheries later in the 1900s. And then we kind of phased away from the commercial fisheries and more into the sport fishery that exists today. And of course, we do still have commercial fishing on the Great Lakes. We also still have subsistence fishing on the Great Lakes, but now we have really more of a mix of all three types. So we're going to go back to considering what the Great Lakes were like before all the alterations from invasive species. And we had a lot of planktivorous fish, a lot of forage fish, you might think of them, that were very abundant. They were the most abundant fish in the Great Lakes. And these were the deep water ciscos. There's also a shallower water cisco that for some reason people call lake herring, but its proper name is cisco. And then you have several types of deep water cisco, including the blackfin cisco, the kai, the bloater. So in Lake Michigan, we had these 6 types of deep water ciscos, and they're very similar species. People argued, they've been reclassified at different times as different morphotypes or ecotypes or subspecies or even distinct species, depending on if you're a lumper or a splitter. But they're very interesting fish. They ranged in size from the larger blackfin cisco that was almost the size of a small whitefish to the smaller bloater. And in offshore waters, the Great Lakes, we really only had one open water predator, which was the lake trout. And similar to the ciscos, there were actually several different forms of lake trout. There was a deep water lake trout, also called the ciscoette, which is a very fatty lake trout. Not only does it gain weight readily, its meat, its flesh is actually very high in fat content, to the point where apparently you can dry them out and burn them because they have so much oil in their flesh. And those fish typically live their entire life below about 300 feet deep. So we had the deep water lake trout, which we still have in Lake Superior, but not in Lake Michigan. We had the shallower lean lake trout, and we also had what they call humpers, which tended to live on offshore humps or submerged islands. So if you look at the simplified food chain going back to the early 1900s and prior, we start with the producer level, which in an aquatic ecosystem is phytoplankton, suspended plants that fix nitrogen and get energy from the sun. So these phytoplankton were food for zooplankton. Again, we're dealing at a microscopic level here on a lot of filter feeding organisms that ate the plankton, and then the ciscos were the main consumers of zooplankton. And on offshore waters in particular, then we had the lake trout as really the only top predator. So it was a pretty simple food web. Of course, this is greatly simplified even from what it was. And you also had a benthic pathway where organisms that died, the detrital rain that came down to the bottom of the lake was processed by benthic bottom-dwelling species. And these were food along with zooplankton and small fish for benthivorous fish like whitefish and yellow perch. And of course, all of these fish depended upon zooplankton at their larval stage, because even larval ciscos and lake trout live out in the main body of Lake Michigan, and then really depend on zooplankton to get to a size where they can prey on their normal prey. So the first invasive species that really threw a wrench in this whole system was the sea lamprey, which is really a unique fish, a jawless species. You saw the picture of the oral disc up there earlier, and this is what that can do to a fish. This is very susceptible if you're a trout or salmon, because trout and salmon have very small scales, and sea lamprey attach themselves to the side of a fish and then rasp a hole in the skin, kind of a way to get the bodily fluids of the fish out. And that's how they feed. They don't have a jaw, so they can't really compete with other jawed fish that can chase their prey around and attack them. But they managed to survive for 230 million years by becoming parasites in their native Atlantic Ocean. But when you have a fish that attacks larger fish in this manner, and it moves from an area like the Atlantic Ocean, which has a lot of very large marine fish, to a smaller system like the Great Lakes, then they become predators. And instead of just parasitizing a larger fish and leaving the host fish alive, the lamprey often kills its host in the Great Lakes. Sometimes only 1 out of 7 fish survive a Great Lakes sea lamprey attack. And one lamprey can kill up to 40 pounds of lake trout in its life. So you saw the collapse of lake trout in Lake Michigan. Of course, they were being commercially fished here prior to 1938 when the sea lamprey made its way in through the Welland Canal. But by the 1950s, there were essentially no lake trout left to catch in Lake Michigan. And people often get the idea that, well, that we've solved the sea lamprey problem for one, which we haven't entirely solved. It's an ongoing problem, an arms race, if you will. And the other misconception is that our lake trout, they're doing just fine. We restored them. And that's not the case either. We still stock a lot of lake trout, and they're starting to reproduce naturally, but for many, many decades there was almost no lake trout reproduction in Lake Michigan. So the strains that have been restocked over the decades probably don't really account for all the genetic variability and the different strains of lake trout that were originally in Lake Michigan. In fact, we had river spawning lake trout. Back in the early 1800s, there were lake trout that would ascend rivers like salmon and spawn in upriver environments. And those have been gone for a very long time because of dams. And the other big invader that came in was the alewife around the same time that the sea lamprey was able to make its way up into the upper Great Lakes. The alewife also came in through the Welland Canal and was able to bypass Niagara Falls and get into the upper Great Lakes. And the alewife, of course, for those who were around in the late 1950s and early 1960s, these were a huge nuisance to beachgoers and waterfront property owners because they would just litter the beach with die-offs, just thousands and thousands of tons of alewife up and down the beach, sometimes windrows hundreds of miles long along Lake Michigan beaches. And it got so bad that there were specially designed pieces of equipment to go out and try to just groom the beach and pick up these dead alewife in areas. So what happened to the Deepwater Cisco in all of this? Well, in Lake Michigan, we now only have one left. We only have the bloater. And there's a couple reasons for that. So if you take a look at the effects of the sea lamprey and alewife, when the sea lamprey became this new top predator, this new apex predator in the system, they basically wiped out the lake trout. So you would think, if you have heard about the term trophic cascade, when you have a disruption at the top of the food chain, you have this cascade down each one of the different food levels or trophic levels. So you'd expect that if a new top predator wiped out the old top predator, that you'd have a big explosion of ciscos, since they were the main plankton eating fish, and now they don't have any predators left in the system. But what actually happened was ciscos almost disappeared except for the bloaters, and we got this explosion of alewife and another invader called the rainbow smelt. So part of the reason that we were able to see such a proliferation of these alewife was the fact that we had a void at the top of the historic food chain. And of course, once you wipe out the ciscos and shift to alewife, which becomes super abundant to the point where they eat most of their prey, the zooplankton, they actually changed the size composition of zooplankton too. They got rid of the larger forms like Daphnia that really provided a good meal for larger plankton eating fish, and they shifted it to smaller types of zooplankton like rotifers and smaller forms of copepods. And this meant that larval fish had problems getting past what they call the critical phase of life. So larval fish, they have this little yolk sac when they're first born, but at some point when that yolk sac is gone and used up, they have to switch to exogenous feeding. And if they don't have prey of the right size to fit into their tiny little mouths available very close by, they'll starve to death. And that's why fish produce so many thousands of young, just in hopes that one or two might make it. Well, for a long time in the Great Lakes, these larval fish of all species had a really tough time making it, and in fact still do. Perch and whitefish are a couple that really are still taking a hit, probably from this same mechanism today. So what happened to alewife? Well, we managed to solve the problem in a way by stocking Pacific salmon. First the Chinook salmon, or first the coho salmon in 1966, and then the Chinook salmon in 1967. And these fish do a great job eating alewife. They're not native fish, but they were stocked to provide a fishery and to take advantage of this explosion of alewife. And they've become so popular with recreational anglers that they really, they're now talking about problems having too few alewife left to sustain the level of fishing that we used to have. And this kind of sums that up. If you see the black bars are the number of Chinook salmon stocked in Lake Michigan. And from the 1960s to about the mid 80s, it was great for fisheries managers because they stocked salmon, everyone loved it. They stocked more salmon, people caught more fish. That's the red line. You see the red lines going up through the 70s. As more fish are stocked, people catch more fish. But that started to break down in the late 1980s when all of a sudden the stocking numbers had to be reduced because the harvest was actually falling. And when you get into the early 1990s, the stocking level remained very high, but the number of fish being caught really started to plummet because of bacterial kidney disease, or BKD. And the thing about fish is if they're healthy, they're a lot more resilient to disease, right? So bacterial kidney disease may have been really a kind of a problem that was related to this imbalance of predator and prey to begin with. So as time went on, we started to reduce stocking more, and it was difficult to get buy-in from anglers because we had this very popular fishery, and people think, oh, if you stock more fish, then we'll have more fish to catch. And we really worked with anglers and biologists, worked to communicate better the fact that we needed to stop stocking as many fish in order to balance the prey and the predators. So it's interesting that the prey in this case was, again, the invasive alewife. So we have this entire management paradigm now based on trying to balance the number of alewife with other fish. And of course, alewife have negative impacts on a lot of native fish as well. So the original idea of using salmon to control the number of alewife and therefore alleviate the effects of alewife on fish like perch and walleye and whitefish is kind of still a balancing act. And now we have additional invasive species, right, like zebra and quagga mussels that have thrown more wrenches into the system just when we think we're getting to equilibrium with what we had before. So zebra and quagga mussels obviously have been a big issue since they started to invade in the 1980s. 86 was the first year that the zebra mussel made its way into Lake St. Clair. And I was fishing Lake St. Clair at the time, and people got really worried that it was going to be the end of fishing because, again, these are filter feeders that really knock out the very base of the food chain. They can feed directly on the phytoplankton. So they can deprive the zooplankton of the food that they need to provide food for fish. And when zebra mussels came in, it was pretty obvious they cleared the water up a lot. So some fish that really do better in more turbid water that's not as clear, fish like walleye, didn't seem to do quite as well. But we also had an explosion of fish like smallmouth bass and muskie in Lake St. Clair, despite the fact that we had this invasion of quagga mussels. So people started to say, or zebra mussels, people started to say, well, maybe the zebra mussels weren't as bad as we thought they were. And in fact, they weren't as bad as the early computer models suggested they would be. But then we got the quagga mussels. And it goes to show when you look at the history of how people were talking about zebra mussels versus quagga mussels when they first appeared, that we don't always get it right when we do these modeling exercises and we try to predict what's going to happen when a new invasive gets into a brand new ecosystem. So whereas the zebra mussels, we thought, well, this is going to be a terrible thing and devastate fisheries. When the quagga mussels came in, originally there were a couple of studies that suggested they wouldn't be as bad. And in fact, they were far worse, especially in places like Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, where they were able to live deeper than zebra mussels, which are typically found in about 50 feet of water or less. And they were also able to live in different kinds of substrate. So whereas a zebra mussel attaches on top of a rock with byssal threads that hold it up in the water column enough where they can filter recirculating water that has plankton in it, right? A quagga mussel can live buried in the silt because of this siphon that they have. If you see that arrow pointing out the siphon that can stick out of the shell and get just up above any kind of soft silt or sediment that a quagga mussel is buried in, which again, a zebra mussel can't do. They have to attach to something. So you'll see them attach even to native mussels or to the backs of crayfish or a boat lift. They'll attach to anything that's hard. Well, the quagga mussel, again, doesn't have to do that. So they could utilize a whole lot of habitat that the zebra mussel could not utilize. They can also feed more efficiently in colder water. So they had a lot of impacts, and we're still working to figure out exactly what they've done and how. But one of the things we saw was the decline of this diparia, which is a amphipod, a small, kind of innocent-looking shrimp-like creature that provided a lot of food for fish like perch and whitefish. A lot of our native fish ate this benthic invertebrate, which virtually disappeared after quagga mussel and zebra mussel became established. So now all those fish that used to eat diparia, a lot of them are trying to switch to eating quagga mussels. And there's a lot of quagga mussels, but when you eat a quagga mussel, you get mostly shell. So even though it's an abundant food resource, and it's a good thing that fish are able to utilize them, fish like whitefish eat a tremendous amount of quagga mussels, but they can only effectively eat the smaller ones, and then they do not grow nearly as well eating quagga mussels as they do when they eat diparia. So this is one of the new figures in our Life of the Lakes book that I put together because I thought it would be interesting to take this trophic pyramid that we see in basic ecology textbooks. When you see this example, it's typically with something like a lion on the plains of the Serengeti up at the top, and then maybe wildebeest and gazelles at the next level down, and then grass. But in the Great Lakes, we're dealing with more microscopic organisms, but you can still take the same basic equations and figure out bioenergetically how much life it takes at each level of this trophic pyramid to sustain or produce fish at the top. So a 10-pound salmon, for example, a pretty typical, small to medium-sized Chinook salmon in Lake Michigan, has to consume 75 pounds of alewife to get to 10 pounds. So that 10-pound salmon represents consumption of 75 pounds of alewife, which in turn represents consumption of 2,000 pounds of zooplankton. And those 2,000 pounds of zooplankton would have consumed more than 7,500 pounds of phytoplankton. So this kind of puts it in perspective. When you talk about changes, especially large changes at the very base of this food pyramid, how it can quickly have a big impact at the top. It takes a tremendous amount of biomass consumed over a period of time to produce those fish that we like to catch. So this also gets to an old debate in fisheries and limnology of top down versus bottom up. And as often happens in science, if you look at the original papers, it was kind of two schools of thought and strong opinions on both sides. And the picture there from the experimental lakes area in Ontario really sums up the bottom up argument. You could really see that when a curtain was strung across this channel in a natural lake in Ontario, and one side was fertilized with phosphorus and the other side wasn't, the side that was fertilized turned bright green. So it was a pretty much a slam dunk, right? It was very clear that the productivity of that side was being controlled by phosphorus. And when you up the amount of that limiting nutrient, you saw an increase all the way up the food chain. So the top down point of view was summed up in a trophic cascade paper. And I kind of outlined that with the sea lamprey. When you have a big perturbation at the top, that has cascading effects all the way down as well in some instances. So, through the decades here, we kind of recognize these now as complementary concepts. And you can't always say that one mechanism always works in all freshwater ecosystems. It's not always a matter of top down. It's not always a matter of bottom up. But when we look at the problems that Great Lakes fisheries are facing, we're seeing a lot of declines in forage fish, again, particularly alewife now. Even though they are an invasive, we're really concerned about why they're declining and what's controlling their numbers. So there's a lot of potential possibilities. The dry-scented mussels, the quaggas and zebra mussels could be filtering out plankton. It could be the disappearance of diparia that's affecting them. It could be reductions in phosphorus due to the Water Quality Act. We actually had too much phosphorus coming in artificially back in the good old days of the Great Lakes sport fishery, for example. Could be other ballast-borne invaders like the fishhook and spiny water fleas that came in the 1980s and 90s and really proliferated to the point where you have these really large zooplankton. You can actually see them with the naked eye. They have such a long spine on them that many small fish can't really process them as well and consume them. Plus, they are predators themselves on other types of zooplankton. So they can basically slice open smaller types of zooplankton. They're messy eaters. They don't even efficiently transfer the smaller zooplankton energy into their own new trophic level, so to speak. So it could be a variety of things. So as part of the revision to the Life of the Lakes book, we looked at a paper by a whole bunch of different authors, really from all different agencies working in all of the Great Lakes. This paper, it was led by Bo Banal with USGS, looked at all 5 Great Lakes and looked at all the possible bottom-up and top-down regulation mechanisms. So it was a very broad-reaching paper that really condensed a whole lot of information into a short paper. And one of the big things that people have just realized that brings some urgency to this was the decline of salmon in Lake Huron, where we had an alewife population crash in 2004, and fish were literally starving to death. So the fish on the board there, you can see how skinny it is and how pinched in its belly is. And that should have been a mature fish. So you had a situation where adult female fish were not able to produce viable eggs because they were so emaciated. So during this time, charter fishing declined by 51%, and it has not bounced back all the way yet. So when we look at Lake Huron, we can kind of relate what happened there in the food web to what actually happened on the ground to people whose livelihoods depended on it. And putting this kind of in graphical format, if you look at the total phosphorus in Lake Huron before dry-scented mussels invaded, this would be 1985 to 1990, we had 4 parts per billion phosphorus, 12 pounds of zooplankton per acre, and about 1 pound of game fish, trout or salmon per acre as well, with a water clarity of about 28.9 feet on average. So then again, this data comes from all these different agencies who are collecting it, USGS, EPA, state DNR, and they found that phosphorus was cut in half by 2005 to 2010 after the dry-scented mussel invasion. And again, this is total phosphorus, so that includes all the phytoplankton that are now being filtered out by the dry-scenteds. And this reduced zooplankton down to 8 pounds per acre. And we saw game fish decline by about 40%. And of course, water clarity increased from 28.9 to 45.4 feet. And meanwhile, we had dry-scenteds increase to 116 per square foot on average. So pretty dramatic changes, and through several years with multiple agencies, that's a lot of good information to say that yes, we had a real reduction in productivity kind of across the board, but it doesn't say exactly why. So they went further and they analyzed the trend in each of these trophic levels from 1998 to 2010. And they actually found no trend in trout and salmon, which is interesting because there was actually a decline in Chinook salmon, but not so much with lake trout. So even though you didn't really pick up a trend, there was a change in species composition. The forage fish did trend down, the plankton trended down, and phosphorus also trended down. So again, there were clear trends, but was this due to top down or bottom up? So they looked at correlations between each level, And they did find evidence for bottom-up regulation all the way up to the trout and salmon. And then they also looked at native benthos. This would be the diparia and other native bottom-dwelling organisms, which also declined at this time. So you can compare that to Lake Michigan, because a lot of people are saying for the last, really since 2014 or 2004, is Lake Michigan going to turn into Lake Huron? Are we going to see the same kind of collapse? And again, if you look at the pre to post quagga mussel invasion periods, we see a decline in phosphorus by not quite half, a decline in zooplankton, and less of a decline in game fish. They did decline, but remember it was a 40% drop in Lake Huron, and it's a pretty small drop in Lake Michigan. The water clarity did indeed improve, and the dreissenids went from nothing to over 1,000 per foot squared. So actually even more abundant by about a factor of 10 in Lake Michigan versus Lake Huron, having clear effects, right? So what about the top down versus bottom up? It's kind of a different story. In Lake Michigan, there was actually an increasing trend for trout and salmon. And oddly enough, there was a decreasing trend in forage fish, no trend in zooplankton, and then declines in chlorophyll A, which is a representative of the amount of algae and phytoplankton out there, and phosphorus. So things were a little less clear cut. And the fishery kind of bore this out because people were still having really good catch rates of trout and salmon, certainly up through 2010 and even later to 2012. So they found evidence for bottom-up regulation at the bottom end of the food web, but actually found top-down regulation when it comes to trout and salmon and forage fish. So your trout and salmon are actually decreasing the number of alewife during this time period. It's interesting when you look at the native benthos, again, the diparia, there was a bottom-up effect. So you can think of those alewife as getting squeezed from both sides. They've lost their diparia, their high-quality food source on one side, so their energy density is less, and they really pack less caloric content than they used to because they're not in good shape. And then from the top down, you have the trout and salmon maintained at high levels, and in part through stocking, but also a lot of natural reproduction now with fish like salmon, Chinook salmon in particular. So it was kind of a difficult situation. And again, it takes a few years for all this information to get rolled together and analyzed and quality control checked and published. But since 2010, we've started to see a decline in the number of trout and salmon as well. So we think that, at the time this was written and analyzed, it was showing this kind of squeeze on the bait fish that really couldn't last for too long. So again, there's evidence for both top down and bottom up forcing in Lake Michigan, whereas Lake Huron, you saw that really clear bottom up all the way, and a big impact all the way through the food chain with the quagga mussel invasion. But again, both processes are important. So it's really important for fisheries managers now to be conscious of not having too many predators out there. So if you look at the number of predator fish being harvested in Lake Michigan, you can see that it's declined pretty steadily in recent years, and it's now below the target set by Great Lakes Fishery Commission for harvest, right? There's that 6,000 pound, or it's actually 6 million because it's thousands of pounds. And that lower black line, going all the way back to 1985, even through BKD years in the early 90s, it never went below that line until about 2014. And it's been below that line ever since. And we do have new numbers now for 2020, which, 2020 was a very difficult year to get out and sample. So we didn't have as much coverage on biological sampling around the lake. But they were able to come up with harvest estimates again in 2020, and they're still below that line and have actually declined since 2019. Same thing holds true for lake whitefish. And again, whereas the salmon and trout are the principal game fish for sport anglers and charter fishermen, the whitefish is the principal food fish that's harvested by both state and tribal commercial fishers. And now again, since right about the same time period here in about 2015, you dip below that line, that target harvest amount, and it's declined ever since. And this is becoming a very big problem because commercial fishers are not able to harvest the whitefish that keeps their families eating and able to pay their bills. So there's a lot of tension now between sport fishers and both commercial and tribal fishers over allocation of fish. And there's there've been a couple of bills in front of the Michigan State Legislature trying to regulate commercial fisheries in different ways. And it's a very contentious issue now, but it comes to this problem where the commercial fishers have historically done very well just harvesting lake whitefish, and there's not much conflict there when it comes to the sport fishers. But now the commercial fishers are considering trying to target other types of fish where there's more conflict. So when it comes to reporting and researching invasive species, there's a great website I know you all know about, MISSIN, which feeds into the same databases that this GLANCYS system run by NOAA and GLERL, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, kind of repackages the same data with a focus on the Great Lakes. So GLANCYS stands for Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System. And you can get a whole lot of different information, including maps of locations on GLANCYS. You can also use it to report new findings directly. And it's not just for the Great Lakes proper, it's for the whole region. So any Great Lakes invasive species that's found in an inland lake or wetland or a river would also be reported here. So if you look at zebra mussel distribution, I'm sure many of you have properties on inland lakes or visit inland lakes for fishing and boating. And zebra mussels, of course, have spread to a lot of different inland lakes. You can see it's not quite completely covering the lower peninsula of Michigan, but there's a lot of lakes that have been invaded by zebra mussels already. And when people see an invasive mussel in an inland lake, they probably assume it's a zebra mussel. But the quagga mussel is also extremely abundant in the Great Lakes, but not so abundant inland. So it's possible that quagga mussels have gotten into a lot of inland lakes and not been recorded because there's not nearly as much biological sampling geared to mussels in inland lakes. You do see in the northwest part of the state, the big oligotrophic kind of clear water bodies like Torch Lake and the other large lakes in that chain near Traverse City and further up to the tip of the mitt, like Burton Mullet Lake, are some of the lakes that do have quagga mussels recorded. But in Southwest Michigan, it's only a couple of drowned rivermouth lakes that are right near the coast there. So if you do see mussels in an inland lake, take a close look at them. The easiest way to tell a zebra mussel from a quagga is that if you have the whole shell and you put it on a flat surface like a table, the zebra mussel shell will sit flat on that surface because it has a flat ventral side. And the quagga mussel doesn't. It has an uneven kind of curve to it, so it'll tip over. It won't sit nice and neat on the table like a zebra mussel will. So the quagga is rounder in shape. It tends to have a little bit more washed out coloration to it, especially near the hinge. And if you look at the ventral side, you see that the zebra mussel is very symmetrical and kind of comes to a point, and the groove, the byssal groove on the one on the right, which is the quagga mussel, Dreissena bugensis is the quagga. You can see that it looks very different. It's not symmetrical and it has that kind of wave to the groove. So again, left there is Dreissena polymorpha. That's the zebra mussel. Right is the quagga mussel, Dreissena bugensis. And another one to watch out for in inland lakes and streams for that matter is the round goby. And what you want to look for here is fused pelvic fins. So if you look at kind of where the chest of the fish is, it has one fin where there should be two because the fins are fused together in kind of a suction cup. And a lot of goby species use these suction cups to stick to rocks and kind of anchor themselves in the current. They also have a prominent black spot at the base of the first dorsal fin, which sometimes you can't see unless you raise that fin up. But round gobies, anyone who fishes for perch or panfish, if there are gobies around, they will attack almost anything and you'll catch them. I've caught a lot of gobies on lures that are 3 or 4 inches long. They're supposed to imitate a goby, and you'll catch 3 or 4 inch long gobies on that lure. They'll basically impale themselves on a hook that's too big to even get in their mouth. They're extremely voracious predators. And when they first came in, again, people were really annoyed by them, for one, because they are bait stealers and they displaced a lot of our native fish like perch, where you used to be able to go and catch perch on rock piles or near piers. All of a sudden you could catch nothing but gobies by the mid to late 1990s. And the one good thing about gobies is they actually eat the quagga and zebra mussels. They're able to grab the shell and then crush the shell with large pharyngeal molars in their back of their throat. So they're definitely a nuisance. We definitely don't want them around. They displace native fish. They've actually really displaced small native fish like sculpins and darters. But there's this one little silver lining where they not only eat zebra and quagga mussels, but they're also good food for fish like bass and walleye. So it's tough to tell people that, but we really don't want anyone spreading these things around. It's actually illegal to capture them alive and move them from one area to another and use them as bait, because we definitely don't want them getting into places where they haven't already got into on their own. And one thing you can do if you're traveling around the state is to keep your eyes open, because they have been moved probably by bait bucket to a couple of inland locations, but not very many. The main way that gobies seem to be moving inland is by swimming up streams, and they're actually not very strong swimmers at all. They have a very small home range. Once they set up shop, they really hold to the same patch of rocks during the summer and until they move deeper to overwinter. They have a pretty small home range. They don't like to swim against strong currents. So over the last couple of decades, they've generally made it upstream to about the first dam in many of our West Michigan rivers. But we should keep an eye out, because there are a lot of rivers that they haven't moved too far up yet that are not dammed, like the Pere Marquette. And in other areas, it wouldn't take much for someone to accidentally move them from one place to another if they weren't aware that you are not allowed to do that. So keep an eye out for gobies in inland waters around the state. Again, they've been spreading, but it's been a slow spread. So you have to see what they'll actually do in rivers. We haven't had any studies that I'm aware of in rivers where trout and salmon spawn. And because gobies are such voracious predators and they live in the rocky areas that salmon and trout like to spawn, they could be an important predator on spawning trout and salmon, as well as native fish like walleye in places where they spawn in rivers. So that's all I had for the prepared talk today, and I'd be happy to take some questions if you want to type them into the Q&A. And certainly want to acknowledge a lot of people who worked on the research I was reporting on, like Bo Bunnell and Chuck Medengian at USGS and Steve Pothoven at NOAA, as well as Caitlin and Todd at Michigan Sea Grant, who helped with a lot of the graphics and representation of food web trends. So with that, if we have any questions, we can open it up. I can stop sharing my screen, I guess.
And I don't see any questions right now, Dan, but I have one for you.
Okay.
The last time I heard you speak, I picked up an Invaders of the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm.
Does the Sea Grant still provide these?
Well, we have them somewhere. We don't work in our offices anymore, so
right.
I have a box somewhere in an office. We do have a bookstore through University of Michigan, and I did hear that we are open for our online bookstore. So you may check the Michigan Sea Grant webpage and the bookstore listing for that Invaders guide. I'm not sure if they have any left or not, though, off the top.
So we don't know if it's still being published.
Yeah, I don't think it's been being published, but it did have a large run, and I think we still have some stock somewhere.
Okay, and the other book I wanted to mention, I've mentioned this several times, You also can get this through MSU Bookstore, and it's Invasive Plants and Species. And it does talk about some of the plants that Eric Elgin talked about that are invading the Great Lakes and our rivers and lakes around us. So those are the two books that I have. Oh, we have some questions.
All right, I see one question on Cisco's. So most of the Cisco's are extinct. And could you talk about this more? It is a complicated issue because the taxonomic situation with Cisco's is still not entirely clear. And that's just dealing with what we have left. There are a lot of forms that we have specimens of in museums that we know are different, like longjaw Cisco, but it varies from place to place whether or not they're extirpated. So most of them are not completely extinct, other than one that is actually called the deepwater Cisco, Coregonus alpina, I believe that is. But one of the ones that we thought was extinct was blackfin Cisco, Coregonus nigripinus, and that one has been found in Lake Nipigon, which attaches to Lake Superior in Ontario. So just within the last 10 years or so, it's become clear that we actually still have some blackfin Cisco, even though they were listed as extinct at one time. So some of the other species like Kai is extirpated. Like the figure I showed was for Lake Michigan. And even though Kai are disappeared from Lake Michigan, they're still fairly common in Lake Superior. So of all the lakes, Lake Superior has done best and maintained more of its deepwater Cisco and other native fish than any of the other Great Lakes, which were heavily fished. They're warmer bodies of water. They were more susceptible to sea lamprey invasion and dry-scented mussel invasions. So again, Cisco's, now it's a big issue for restoration because people are trying to decide if we should go ahead and try to reintroduce different forms of Cisco in just different places. So the bloater, which is the one we still have in Lake Michigan, has been reintroduced now into Lake Ontario. But then there are some debates because the Cisco, the one that used to be called Lake Herring, it's not a deepwater Cisco, this is Coregonus ardidii, actually has different forms within that species as well. And one of the forms is doing very well in Lake Michigan. And there was recently a big debate about whether we should stock another form from Lake Superior that might have been here in the past and might have lived more offshore. So when it gets to the management decisions and the different brood stock options, it does get a little complex. And I believe we still have some good discussions on our website. If you're interested on the Michigan Sea Grant YouTube channel, we have Chuck Bronte from Fish and Wildlife Service and Jory Jonas from Michigan DNR talk about really the ins and outs of what was being considered for restoration on Lake Michigan and why some people were against it as well. Another question on the status of ballast water treatment regulation and enforcement, which is for boats, of course, probably thinking mostly about the ocean-going freighters, which now there has been no ballast on board regulations for a couple decades, I believe, and kind of a swish and spit regulation where they're supposed to suck in salt water and then flush that out as well to make sure that more invaders aren't coming in fresh or brackish water that might have been transported all the way across the ocean from places like the Black and Caspian Sea were the main culprits, because you had these large brackish seas where transatlantic freighters were taking in the water that it contained things like zebra mussel, quagga mussels, gobies, spiny water fleas, and transporting them to the Great Lakes, and just dumping all that fresh or brackish ballast water into the Great Lakes. So those regulations alone have been pretty effective at dropping the rate of new infestations now. It was running, one new invasive species every couple months. Now it's down to one invasive species every 4 years. So that was since the original regulations, but there's still an ongoing debate about what kind of regulations we should have as far as ballast water treatment, and there's still I think the jury's still out on that. But update on Asian carp. The debate really shifted, and we lost some momentum. A few years back, if you go back to 2009, when people were finding the environmental DNA in the Chicago River system, and one big head carp was caught upstream of electric barriers that exist now in Chicago. There was a tremendous amount of public uproar about it and keeping them out of the Great Lakes. And there's been a lot done. They still net for those fish. They pay commercial fishers to try and net areas that have low densities of Asian carp in upstream areas of the Chicago River system, which of course is artificially connected to Lake Michigan. And there have been eDNA testing efforts around the Great Lakes that have actually found both silver and big head carp DNA in places like Sturgeon Bay in Wisconsin on Lake Michigan and in Lake Erie. But now there's some debate about what that really means, because we haven't come up with live fish. So a weird kind of caveat to that is we did catch live big head carp in Lake Erie back in the late 90s and 2000, and they never got a foothold. They did not successfully reproduce as far as we know. So it's really, a case where that's not to say they're not a danger. We know that enough of them get in, they will find a place to reproduce, and they will proliferate. But right now, the only one that has is the grass carp, which is found in Lake Erie now and has spawned in the Sandusky River in Ohio. So the thing is, people think of Asian carp and they think of the big plankton eating carp that are basically going to be like another quagga mussel, just sucking the bottom out of the food web. But the one we do have is the grass carp, which eats all of the macrophytes, or aquatic plants that provide food for waterfowl and nursery habitat for fish. So it's another big problem, but it's a totally different kind of problem. We're actually worried that they're going to take shallow, clear, vegetated areas, eat all the vegetation, rip it up, and turn them into kind of pea soup, because these carp, they eat vegetation, but they don't digest it very well. Most of it goes right through them. So they're very inefficient, and they basically just destroy all of the aquatic plants. So what should you do if you catch a goby? For years, there were some people who said, "Oh, you have to kill everyone you catch." You're not allowed to just discard fish carcasses on public property. So you would sometimes see people just catch gobies and throw them on the bank or pile them up on the pier. And no, you're not supposed to do that. If you do kill them, dispose of them properly. However, if you're killing them in an area like along a pier in the Great Lakes, where they've been firmly established now for decades, and they're actually providing a food source as well for fish, I don't think you're really doing any good by killing a few of them. And it's not to say it's a bad thing to get rid of them either, but it's not. There's no law that says you have to kill every goby you catch, and what you cannot do is transport it alive to somewhere else. That's the main thing. Don't move them anywhere else. And if you find one in a place that it's not, then definitely kill it and put it in your freezer and email me or report it to Glancis. If you find them in inland lakes or rivers where they haven't been found recently or before at all, then you should definitely be careful and let people know. That's really the only window of opportunity we have. And it's, with gobies, it's doubtful we could really do much. There have been experiments on trying to use like seismic waves to destroy them, and they actually found out it killed other fish, but the gobies were fine because they didn't have a swim bladder. They're tough fish. It's hard to control them selectively, but at least if we know they're in a new area, then that's the only time there's really an opportunity to nip it in the bud. because once any invasive species really gets established, it becomes an arms race, like with the lamprey, where we're still treating lamprey everywhere. They're reproducing on a 4 to 7 year basis with pesticides like TFM, or intentionally damming and blocking rivers to prevent them from getting in. So how do all the changes affect the sturgeon? The lake sturgeon were really decimated by a combination of the destruction of rivers through logging, the damming of rivers, the overharvest that related when they were first opened up as a commercial fish, and caviar processing began in the Great Lakes region. But the more recent changes, as far as we know, may not have been a bad thing. When researchers with DNR try to catch sturgeon for population estimates on the St. Clair River, what they do is they bait hooks with gobies and they catch a bunch of sturgeon. So we know that sturgeon eat gobies. They also can eat mussels, and because they're a bottom-dwelling benthic fish, they're not really as affected by declines in the offshore pelagic productivity that all of the trout and salmon are feeling. So I'm sure it's not a good thing. Again, when you're trying to subsist on fish or shellfish, so to speak, like tricenid mussels, you're probably not getting a good energetic return as you did before. But there's been a lot of research and restoration work going on with sturgeon, and in places where that's happening, they do seem to be on a bit of an upward trajectory. Also, as I mentioned, the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair, they're not stocked. Lake sturgeon are actually doing pretty well and still reproducing successfully every year, as far as I know. And those areas were some of the first to get hit by both zebra mussels and by round goby. So I'm not sure if it's going to be a huge problem for sturgeon. They might be poised to do pretty well, actually. So what fish are stocked in the Great Lakes today? Oh, I don't have a number. It's a lot, though. We have primary fish, sport fish you might think of would be the Chinook salmon, coho salmon, the steelhead, brown trout, and also lake trout. Again, lake trout are a native fish, but stocking is still essential to maintain their populations, especially in Lake Michigan. Then we have other fish that are stocked in tributaries of the Great Lakes, like walleye. Again, walleye, people see them, we know they're a native fish, but they are propagated in large numbers and stocked in rivers that feed into the Great Lakes, like the Grand River and the Muskegon River. And those walleye then provide fisheries off those ports in Lake Michigan, as well as in the river and attached lakes. Another one that's started to get stocked in the last 8 or 9 years in West Michigan is the Great Lakes muskie, which is native all around the state, but was greatly reduced in numbers. So Great Lakes muskie are still doing really well in Lake St. Clair, but they're gone from the west side of the state. So they're now stocking Great Lakes muskie in places like the Lower Grand and Muskegon. And we are stocking some Cisco's. The Lake Huron and Thunder Bay has been stocked with the offshore strain, if you want to call it that, of the Coregonus ardei, the lake herring. And I'm sure there's more that I'm not thinking of, because we do a lot of stocking. What do you think would happen to the species mix if we stop stocking? That's a great question. We've got a program we're actually doing now with Sea Grant, where we are investigating all kinds of different stocking options and modeling what would happen in different stocking mix scenarios, which we're just starting to be able to do that with multiple species. We did this with just Chinook salmon back in 2012, because at that time, Lake Michigan in particular was 80% Chinook salmon, and they were eating the vast majority of the alewife that were getting eaten. So it was pretty simple to just assume, well, the other stuff's just kind of negligible. But now we've reduced Chinooks because we know they were the #1 single predator on alewife, but it turns out that all the other fish are also eating alewife. So we've got steelhead that are really eating about 95% alewife now. They can switch if they need to, but if they do, we don't know if they're going to grow as well. They probably won't, and we don't know if their numbers will be as high. Lake trout too. Lake trout can eat goby. So if we stop stocking the fish that can reproduce would do the best. And the fish that can reproduce on their own are not necessarily the fish that can survive best once they get on the lake, because if they eat too many alewife, they could be in trouble, right? So the fish that comes to mind is the Chinook salmon is actually the best adapted right now, even though it's not native, to spawn in Michigan rivers and then do well out on their way out to Lake Michigan. So if you picture this as Chinook salmon, it doesn't have that plankton dependent phase of life, as I mentioned with the other ones. Because they're young or born in rivers, they can hatch out in an area that doesn't have plankton. They'll eat river insects, little mayflies and midges. So they would do really well. In fact, 70% of the Chinook salmon in Lake Michigan in most years that are caught by anglers are naturally reproduced fish now. They're not stocked fish. So they would probably do well, which could be a big problem, because if they're doing really well and we're not stocking other fish that rely less heavily on alewife, there's a potential for the fish that would do well in the absence of alewife, fish like steelhead and lake trout, to not do as well. And steelhead, for example, they also spawn in rivers, right? So you think, well, that's good. They should do well, just as well as Chinooks. But Chinooks spawn in the fall. So their young are in these rivers over the winter, and then they leave. And our rivers, of course, are cold in the winter. Turns out trout and salmon young need very cold water. So the Chinook has no problem. The steelhead, though, spawns in the spring, and then their young spend a summer in the river. And if the river gets too warm, they die. And many steelhead actually have to spend 2 whole summers in the river before they leave for Lake Michigan. So you need a lot higher quality water, and there's a lot fewer Michigan rivers that meet the criteria for steelhead spawning versus Chinook. And that's the last question I see. So,
Dan, thank you so much. This was really interesting. And it's nice to find out what's happening right now in our local rivers, lakes, and how that affects the Great Lakes. I would like to remind you, tomorrow night, we're back at it again at 7 p.m. We'll be having Marnie Tichenel from Ohio State will be joining us again for a presentation on how invasive species have an impact on our local wildlife. So I hope that you can all join us for that. And with that, we will, oh, that's from you. I saw the chat box going, Dan. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow night.
all right. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. That was wonderful.
Bye.